The train hissed to a stop in the small town of Ashvale, sending a gust of smoke and cold wind across the empty platform. Only one passenger stepped down, a woman in a weather-worn gray dress, her shoulders wrapped in a threadbare shawl, clutching a small leather suitcase as if it contained everything she had left in the world. Her name was Margaret Hale, and she didn't expect a welcome. But the silence that met her arrival still stung more than she'd anticipated. No one approached. No carriage waited, just eyes peeking through windows, watching from behind crates and curtains. She had come in response to a letter, a promise of work and a place to stay. After months of aimless wandering grief and cold nights on hard floors, the letter had felt like a lifeline. But as soon as she showed the yellowed paper to the innkeeper, his face turned to stone. "You didn't say you were that Margaret Hale," he muttered, stepping back. "You'd best be on your way." She stood frozen. "But you wrote me. You said I could help in the kitchens." He snatched the paper from her hand, scanned it again, and shoved it back at her chest. "That was before we knew. Go. You're not wanted here." The door slammed in her face. Behind her, the few onlookers began whispering. "That's her, the widow of the traitor. Did you see the scar? She was with him when he was caught, you know." Margaret didn't cry, not anymore. Her eyes had dried up somewhere between the gallows and the winter that followed. She turned and walked away from the inn, away from the murmurs, down the muddy main street lined with judgmental stares and boots that refused to step aside. She found a bench near the edge of town and sat, clutching her suitcase. The sky above was iron gray, and snow threatened. She hadn't eaten that day. Her fingers, raw and red, trembled as she tried to tighten the shawl around her. A boy tossed a pebble at her feet and ran off laughing. A group of women passed, crossing themselves and muttering about bad omens. Still, she didn't move. If there was one thing Margaret had learned in the past year, it was how to be still when the world turned against you. Across the street, leaning against the post outside the saloon, stood a man. Tall, broad-shouldered, dark coat dusted with snow. He watched her with unreadable eyes, arms crossed, face weathered like sun-split stone. He said nothing, made no move, just watched. Margaret noticed him, but barely. Men stared sometimes, not with desire, those days were long gone, but with suspicion or something colder. This one was no different, she thought. But he was. As night crept in, Margaret knocked on the back door of the town bakery. The old woman who answered took pity on her, offering a crust of bread and a floor in the barn if she promised to rise before dawn and sweep. Margaret accepted with a nod. She laid her shawl over a pile of hay, curled up against the cold, and closed her eyes. Somewhere far off, a door creaked, boots scraped across wood, a match lit a pipe, and the man across the street, the one who hadn't looked away, was still there, watching the barn until the last candle inside went dark. He said nothing, but he noticed, and that in Ashevail meant more than any welcome ever could. By the time the rooster crowed over the brittle fields of Ashvale, Margaret was already sweeping the frost-dusted porch of the bakery with numb fingers. The old woman, Miss Della, handed her a tin cup of lukewarm tea and a piece of yesterday's bread without a word. Pity, perhaps, or maybe just a habit of kindness too old to be unlearned. Margaret ate quickly, quietly. She knew the rules. Speak little. Don't linger. Don't make people remember your name. But in Ashvale, silence didn't shield you. It fed the rumors. By noon, the whispers had curled their way through the saloon, the general store, and the pews of the whitewashed church. She's the widow of the man they hanged in Dodge. Killed 3 men, ran with bandits. I heard she helped him rob a rail car. She's got the devil in her blood, that one. Just look at her eyes. Margaret kept her gaze low, her steps light. She helped scrub the bakery pans, cleaned the cracked floorboards, chopped firewood behind the kitchen. Her hands, once calloused by embroidery hoops and wedding silver, now cracked and bled from the axe handle. Still, she said nothing. That night, she returned to the barn. No one stopped her. But a group of boys had nailed a crude sign to the door. "Whore of the traitor." She tore it down slowly, as if the motion hurt more than the words. Inside, she sank into the straw, drew her shawl tight, and stared at the beams above her, until the moonlight faded. She remembered her husband's boots stomping through their old cabin, soaked in whiskey and rage. She remembered the way he threw the money bag onto the table and said, "Don't ask questions, Maggie. You don't want the answers." She remembered his last words before the marshal took him. "You think they'll let you walk away clean? You're mine, dead or not." She had run and run and run. But even here, she hadn't outrun the ghost of his name. The next morning, Margaret was sent to deliver bread to the saloon. She kept her head down, her basket tight in her grip. Inside, smoke curled thick in the air, laughter and coughing. The stench of ale and men too far from goodness. She stepped carefully, setting the basket on the counter. "Look what the wind blew in," one of the card players muttered. "Thought we sent the stray dog back to Dodge." Another voice, coarser, older. "Ain't she the one who watched her man swing while biting her tongue? Cowards make poor widows." She didn't look up, just turned to leave. That's when a heavy voice cut through the haze. Not loud but sharp. Final. Enough. The room fell quiet. Chairs scraped, heads turned. At the far end of the bar stood Elias Ward. He hadn't been there when she walked in. No one had seen him rise. But now he stood tall, arms crossed, jaw tight, eyes like thunderclouds about to break. No one argued. No one spoke. Margaret stood frozen, not at the words, but at the man who had said them. She didn't thank him. She couldn't. But she met his eyes. And for the first time in months, someone didn't look away first. By the end of her first week in Elias Ward's cabin, Margaret had learned 3 things. He didn't speak unless necessary. He never left the house without his revolver. And the town feared him more than they feared sin. Elias lived alone on the edge of Ashvale, near the ridgeline where the trees grew thick and the trail turned dangerous. His cabin was plain but well kept, its walls lined with shelves of worn books and tools, a hammer always within reach. The forge stood just outside, where the clang of iron echoed each morning before the sun rose. Margaret kept to her tasks, sweeping the cabin, boiling water for his tea, washing the ash from his shirts. She didn't ask questions. He didn't offer explanations. But she noticed things. The way his hands lingered on the brim of his hat before stepping outside, like he was bracing for something. The way he froze whenever someone knocked at the door. The way he flinched, not visibly but subtly, when the church bell rang in town. And most of all, how he watched her when he thought she wasn't looking. Not with lust, not with suspicion, but with something harder to name. One morning, as Margaret hung laundry behind the cabin, she saw a group of men on horseback riding toward the forge. They wore badges and hard eyes, the sheriff and 2 deputies. She stood still, half hidden behind a line of sheets. The sheriff dismounted and knocked on the forge door. Elias opened it slowly, wiping his hands on a rag, expression blank. "Ward," the sheriff said, "we've had complaints." "About?" Elias asked, voice flat as slate. "About you harboring a woman with a dangerous past." Margaret's blood turned to ice. "She has no charges against her," Elias replied calmly. The sheriff shifted his stance. "Still, folks are uneasy. You know how things work here." Elias stepped forward. "They work the way I say they do. You got a problem with that?" The sheriff met his gaze for one breathless second, then looked away. "No trouble meant, just passing along concerns." "Consider them received," Elias said, and closed the door in his face. The men rode off, but Margaret could still feel the tension in the air long after their dust settled. She finished hanging the sheets in silence. When she returned inside, Elias was at the table, sipping tea like nothing had happened. She placed a bowl of stew in front of him. "Thank you," she said softly. He nodded but said nothing. That night, as the wind howled and the fireplace crackled, Margaret found herself unable to sleep. She stepped into the main room to find Elias sitting by the window, rifle across his lap, eyes fixed on the darkness outside. "You don't have to." "Keep watch for me," she said. He didn't look at her. "It's not for you." "Then who?" Still no answer. Margaret hesitated, then sat across from him, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. The silence between them stretched, not awkward, familiar, like two people who'd long ago run out of things to scream about. After a long while, Elias spoke, voice barely audible. "People think I killed a man for looking at my wife the wrong way." Margaret looked up, surprised. "They're wrong," he added. "I killed him because he touched her." She didn't ask what happened to the wife. She didn't need to. Instead, she said, "They think I helped my husband run guns across the border, that I knew everything, that I stayed because I wanted to." Elias finally turned to face her. "Did you?" "No," she whispered. "I stayed because I was afraid." They stared at each other across the quiet cabin, the firelight dancing between them. Elias leaned back in his chair, his voice low and steady. "Then maybe we're not who they say we are." For the first time in weeks, Margaret allowed herself a fragile smile. Maybe they weren't. Not entirely. The days passed in quiet rhythm. Mornings began with the hiss of steam and the thud of hammer on steel. Elias worked the forge with tireless precision, his brow slick with sweat, his hands black with soot. Margaret would rise early, draw water, prepare coffee, and bring him a simple breakfast. He rarely said thank you, but she noticed he always finished every bite. Their conversations were brief, mostly necessities, but each word shared felt deliberate, like they both understood the fragility of peace and were unwilling to shake it. Margaret took comfort in the silence. After a year of being questioned, accused, shouted at, and spit on, the quiet was a gift. She found tasks to keep her busy, tending to the small garden, repairing curtains, scrubbing soot from the windows. It wasn't glamorous, but it was hers, and no one in town spat at her anymore, because no one dared to walk up the hill to Elias Ward's property. One afternoon, as she folded laundry in the yard, she spotted a deer grazing near the tree line. She stilled. The animal watched her back, calm, curious. A quiet exchange. Then, without sound, it darted away, and when Margaret turned, she saw Elias on the porch, watching not the deer but her. "You used to the quiet?" he asked. She nodded. "It's louder in town, not the noise, the looks." He leaned against the post. "Out here, no one looks. No one judges. They're too scared." "Of you?" she asked. His mouth twitched. "Of the truth." She wanted to ask more. What truth? What had the town buried, and what did Elias know? But she held her tongue. They weren't there yet. Whatever bridge they were building between them, it wasn't strong enough for that weight. That night, it snowed. Margaret woke to the creak of floorboards and found Elias already up, stoking the fire. She joined him quietly, handing him a wool blanket she'd stitched back together. He didn't thank her, but he draped it over his shoulders and didn't take it off. Later that day, they shared stew at the small wooden table. Margaret hesitated, then asked, "Do you ever think about leaving?" Elias stirred his spoon. "No place else would have me." "That's not true." "It is." He set the spoon down. "I've done things, Margaret. Things I won't speak of. This land's the only place that lets me live without asking questions." She understood, in ways he'd never need to explain. "I'm not staying forever," she said quietly, "but I'm staying for now." Elias didn't answer right away. Then, softly, "Good." That night, the wind howled like wolves, rattling the shutters. Margaret sat by the fire, a book open, on her lap. She didn't read. She listened to the way Elias moved in the next room, to the sound of wood creaking under his boots, to the silence between each of his steps. And then, the sound of something small, a drawer opening, a breath held. The next morning, when she swept the cabin, she found it under the table, a torn scrap of paper. She picked it up carefully. It was part of a wanted poster, a familiar face, her husband's. The name below it was smeared with water, but the bounty mark was clear. Someone had once been paid to bring him down. She stared at the torn edges. Why had Elias kept it? Did he know her husband? Had he tracked him? The room felt colder. When Elias returned from the forge for lunch, she watched him closely. He didn't mention the missing poster, didn't look at her the same, but she noticed the way his shoulders stiffened when she stepped closer. He was hiding something, and now she was too. A deal between outcasts, she reminded herself, built on silence, on pain, on secrets. And for the first time since arriving, she felt a ripple of doubt. Not about Elias, but about how much she didn't yet know. The cold arrived hard and fast that week. Snow blanketed the ridgeline in a single night, muting the world beneath a layer of silence. Smoke curled from the chimney of Elias's cabin, rising into the gray sky like a ribbon of warmth in a world turned to frost. Margaret wrapped her fingers around a clay mug as she stood by the window, watching flakes fall. The tea inside had long gone cold, but she held it like it mattered. Behind her, Elias was sharpening a blade, slow and methodical. The scrape of metal against stone filled the cabin, steady as a heartbeat. Neither had spoken of the torn wanted poster. Neither had to. That afternoon, Margaret ventured into town to trade eggs for flour. Heads turned as she walked past, but the usual murmurs had quieted. People might not like her, but now, they feared the man she lived with more than they feared her. Inside the general store, Mrs. Caldwell offered her a tight-lipped smile. "Surprised to see you back down here." "I needed flour," Margaret said simply. "I think someone like Mr. Ward could send someone on his behalf." Margaret met her eyes. "He didn't send me. I go where I choose." Mrs. Caldwell blinked, then turned away. Margaret smiled, not out of malice, but out of something like pride. She'd forgotten what it felt like to stand tall. As she exited the store, her smile vanished. The barn, the one she used to sleep in behind the bakery, was on fire. Flames licked the wooden beams, smoke billowing into the sky. A few men tossed water with no urgency. Others stood back and watched. No one tried to stop it. No one asked how it started. Margaret stood frozen on the edge of the street. That barn had been nothing more than a floor of hay and drafty walls, but it had sheltered her. It had been her last refuge before Elias, and now someone had burned it. On purpose. That night, she told Elias. He didn't ask questions. He just stood, took his coat from the hook, and left. When he returned hours later, his knuckles were bruised and bloodied. He didn't speak. She didn't ask. Instead, she bandaged his hands while the fire crackled behind them. It was the first time she touched him with more than passing necessity. Her fingers were gentle. His eyes never left her face. "You didn't have to do anything," she whispered. "I know," he said. "I did it anyway." The next morning, the townsfolk kept their distance. Whispers returned, but not about Margaret this time. About the man who broke 2 ribs and a jawbone in the back alley behind the saloon. About the shadow with iron eyes and a temper like fire, beneath a frozen lake. Margaret baked cornbread that night. She set the plate between them at the table and poured 2 glasses of cider. For the first time, they ate without silence. "I used to grow herbs," she said suddenly. "Back east in pots near the window, basil, thyme, lavender." Elias nodded. "Lavender's good for sleep." She blinked. "You know herbs?" He shrugged. "My mother taught me." Margaret, mild, unexpected, and soft. "You surprise me, Mr. Ward." His mouth curved slightly. "You do the same, Mrs. Hale." They sat there for a while, talking like people instead of ghosts. Later that week, Elias brought home wooden planks and set them beside the cabin. "What's this?" she asked. "You said you used to grow things." She stared at the wood, her breath catching. "You're building me a garden box?" He shrugged. "Ground's too hard to plant directly. Figured we'd start small." Margaret swallowed, unsure how to respond. So instead of words, she placed a hand over his. It was the first time he didn't pull away. And though neither of them said it, they both knew something was changing. Something neither frost nor fire could erase. Spring came slowly to Ashvale. The snow melted in reluctant patches, revealing muddy earth and brittle grass. The wind still bit at the skin, but the sun stayed out longer, and the air no longer smelled of iron and frost, but of pine, damp soil, and smoke curling from cabin chimneys. Margaret's herb garden began to take shape beside Elias's forge. The wooden box he'd built stood firm, and inside, tiny green shoots had begun to sprout. Lavender, thyme, rosemary. It wasn't much, but it was hers. One morning, while sweeping the cabin porch, Margaret noticed the old saddlebag hanging from a rusty nail beside the door. She had seen it before, but never paid much attention. Today, something about it drew her closer. It was worn and stiff, coated in dust. She reached inside to clean it out, and her fingers brushed against paper. She pulled out a folded envelope, yellowed with time. It was sealed with wax, the kind used on bounty contracts. Her stomach turned. Against her better judgment, she broke the seal. Inside were 2 pages, a bounty poster, tattered but whole, and a handwritten letter. The poster bore a familiar face, her husband's, but unlike the torn piece she'd found before, this one was pristine. And the reward was high. The letter was worse. It was addressed to Elias Ward. Target has confirmed presence in Dakota Territory. Previously seen in Ash Hollow, traveling with female companion presumed to be spouse. Approach with caution. Authorization granted for lethal force upon positive ID. Full reward for live capture. Half for body. Margaret's blood went cold. He had been hired to kill her husband. Her breath caught. She read it again. Elias had known. He hadn't just stumbled into her story. He had been part of it. A piece she'd never known was there. The door creaked behind her. She turned. Elias stood in the doorway, a sack of coal. In one hand, his face unreadable. She held up the letter. "You knew." His jaw tightened. "Yes." "How long?" He stepped forward slowly, placing the coal down. "Since before you came to Ashvale." Her hands shook. "So what was this? Penance?" "No." She stared at him. "Then what?" Elias took a long breath, his eyes never leaving hers. "He ruined lives, Margaret. He trafficked guns, sold information, threatened women. You weren't the only one he hurt." She looked away. "But you didn't kill him." "No." His voice dropped lower. "Someone else got to him first. I found his body 2 days before I found your name in a burned logbook. That's when I stopped hunting. Started watching. Watching me." He nodded once. "You weren't the target. But I wanted to see for myself, if you knew, if you were part of it." Her voice cracked. "And what did you decide? That you were a victim like the rest of us?" She sat down hard on the bench, the letter limp in her hand. "You should have told me." "I didn't want to be just another man who hurt you." They sat in silence for a long moment. The wind outside rustled the garden leaves. "Did you come to kill him?" she asked. "I came to bring him in," Elias said. "Alive, if I could. Dead, if I had to." "And me?" He looked at her, his voice steady. "I didn't know what to do with you, until I saw how you made coffee even when your hands shook. How you sewed my shirts without asking. How you cried in the barn and thought no one could hear." Margaret blinked back tears. "I stayed," he finished, "because you were the first good thing I'd seen in years." She looked at him then, not with fear, but with something realer, deeper, pain, understanding, maybe even trust. She folded the letter and set it beside the saddlebag. "I don't want any more lies." "No more," Elias said. The garden beside the forge swayed in the wind, soft and green, growing quietly between 2 people who had lost more than they could ever name. The calm didn't last. 3 days after Margaret found the letter, the riders came. It was just past noon when a dust trail rose on the southern road. 5 men on horseback, dressed in long coats and wide-brimmed hats, rode into Ashvale like a storm about to break. At their lead was a man with silver spurs and eyes the color of cold steel. His name was Captain Alden Cross, and his reputation preceded him. Margaret saw them from the window. She knew that face. Alden Cross was her late husband's older brother, a man cut from the same cruel cloth but sharpened by discipline and authority. He had once served in the militia. Now he was something else entirely, something dangerous. By nightfall, he was asking questions at the saloon. By morning, the entire town was buzzing. He's looking for the widow. Says she ran with outlaws. Claims she stole money, hid guns, lied under oath. Margaret tried to stay calm, but her hands wouldn't stop shaking. When Elias came home from the forge and saw her, pale face, he said nothing. Just took his rifle from the wall and loaded it. "Are we running?" she asked. "No," he said. "We're done running." The next day, Elias went to town. Margaret stayed behind, pacing the cabin. Every creak of the floorboards, every wind against the glass felt like a warning. She didn't expect the knock at the door. When she opened it, she was staring down the barrel of a revolver. Two of Alden's men forced their way in, grabbing her by the arms. She fought back, kicking, twisting, but one struck her across the cheek, and the world tilted sideways. They dragged her down the hill into the center of town. People gathered. Of course they did. Ashvale had never seen a proper hanging, but they'd seen enough judgment to know how it worked. Alden stood on the church steps, flanked by men with rifles. His voice rang out clear and commanding. This woman aided a known criminal. She lived under false names. She lied to authorities, and now she hides behind the name of a killer. The crowd murmured. Margaret, blood trailing from her lip, was forced to her knees in front of the pulpit. Alden stepped down, crouching beside her. "Did you think you could disappear into the arms of a ghost? That no one would remember what you were?" "I was his wife," she whispered, "not his accomplice." "Same difference," he said, standing. And then he raised his voice. "This town was built on law and order. If no one else will hold her accountable, I will." Someone handed him a rope. Margaret's heart slammed against her ribs. The crowd didn't move, not forward, not back, just watched. Ashevail had always chosen silence over justice, over truth. And then came the sound of boots, slow, heavy, deliberate. Elias Ward walked into the center of the square like a storm, with legs, rifle across his back, axe at his hip, coat flapping in the wind. His eyes locked on Alden. "Let her go," he said, low and even. Alden turned, unimpressed. "You planning to stop me?" Elias didn't answer, just kept walking. One of the men raised his gun. Elias moved like lightning. The rifle came off his back in one smooth motion. A single shot rang out. The man dropped. Panic erupted. People screamed, some ran, others froze. But Elias didn't hesitate. He aimed again, this time at Alden. "I don't want to kill you," Elias said. "But you will?" Alden asked. "If I have to." For a long breath, no one moved. Then Alden smiled bitterly. "She's yours then, keep her. But don't think you've won." Elias didn't respond, just took Margaret's hand and pulled her to her feet. As they walked away, the crowd parted, not out of respect, but out of fear. But Margaret didn't care, because for the first time in her life, someone had chosen her, fought for her, risked everything for her, and she wasn't going to waste it. The cabin felt different after that day, quieter, heavier. Margaret sat by the hearth that evening, arms wrapped around her knees, watching the fire flicker in the grate. Her cheek was bruised, lip split, but it wasn't the pain that kept her quiet. It was the memory of Elias walking into that square with death in his eyes, of the way his finger curled on the trigger without a tremor. He hadn't hesitated. He'd killed a man in broad daylight. For her. Outside, the wind howled through the pines. Inside, Elias sat sharpening a blade at the table, the same way he had on the day they first spoke. Margaret finally broke the silence. "Was he your first?" He didn't look up. "No." "Did you know him?" "No." She swallowed. "Then why?" Elias paused. The scraping stopped. He set the knife down gently and looked at her. "Because he laid hands on you." It was said so simply, so plainly, like stating the weather. "And because no one else was going to stop it," he added. "So I did." Margaret felt the sting of tears but blinked them back. She didn't cry easily anymore. It had taken too much to dry her out. But this was something else. "You could have let them take me," she whispered. "I could have," he agreed. "Didn't want to." She stood slowly and crossed the room. Her fingers brushed the edge of the table. "What happens now?" "They'll come back," Elias said. "Alden, or someone worse, he won't forget." She nodded. "So we run?" "I don't run," he said. She met his gaze. "Then I won't either." He looked at her for a long time. Then he rose. Margaret's breath caught as he stepped closer. His hands, calloused and warm, lifted gently to her face. He touched the bruised skin with reverence, as if her hurt was something sacred. "I'm not good at this," he said quietly. "At what?" "Letting people stay." Margaret's voice trembled. "I'm not good at staying. People always find a reason to send me away." "Not me," Elias said. "I already saw the worst in you." She laughed softly. "That's comforting." "It should be, because I stayed." He leaned down and pressed his forehead to hers. They stood there, two survivors made of splinters and flame, neither whole but both standing. Margaret closed her eyes. When his lips touched hers, it wasn't soft or tentative. It was real, anchored, like a promise, not a fairy tale kind, not the kind whispered under moonlight, the kind forged in fire and blood and broken bones, the kind that meant something. Later, when the fire had died down and the cabin had gone still, they sat together on the floor, shoulder to shoulder. Margaret traced the scar along Elias's forearm. What was this from? "Bandit with a dull knife," he murmured. "Didn't know how to aim." She nodded. "You have a lot of scars. So do you. Mine aren't always visible." "I know," he said, "but I see them anyway." She leaned her head against his shoulder. The world outside was cold and hard. The law had turned its back. The church had closed its doors. But in this cabin, with this man, Margaret had found something she never expected. A home. Not a house. Not a shelter. A person. Someone who had taken her brokenness and made it worth protecting. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring. If Alden would return with more men, if Ashvale would finally turn violent. But for tonight, she was safe, loved, chosen. And no one, not a brother, a preacher, a sheriff, or a town, was going to take that from her again. The next morning, the air was still. Snow had melted from the lower hills, leaving behind damp earth and puddles that reflected the sky like shards of broken glass. A mist clung to the valley, softening the harsh lines of Ashvale. But Margaret knew better than to believe in peace. Just because things looked quiet. Inside the cabin, Elias was already packing. Not with haste or panic, with purpose. Margaret stood in the doorway, arms crossed over her chest, watching as he loaded dried meat, bullets, herbs, and a spare coat into his saddlebag. "We're not staying," she said. It wasn't a question. Elias nodded. "Alden will come back. Or someone worse. I don't want this place to be the hill we die on." Margaret glanced around the small home. The walls she'd scrubbed. The shelf where she'd placed her first tin of lavender. The chair where she'd seen Elias sleep more often than in his own bed. "It's strange," she said softly, "how quickly something becomes yours." He looked at her, his eyes softer than usual. "We'll build another." She smiled, though it hurt. "Promise?" "I don't make promises," Elias said, then added, "but I keep the ones I don't say." They rode out just after noon, cutting through the pine woods along a trail Elias knew from his bounty days. It wound through ravines and across rivers swollen with melted snow. By dusk, they reached a clearing high in the hills, miles beyond where any Ashevale deputy would dare follow. There stood a second cabin, hidden, smaller, but sturdy. "Built years ago," Elias said, "as a place to disappear if the world ever turned too loud." They unpacked in silence. That night, Margaret lit a fire while Elias repaired the lock on the front door. The place smelled of cedar and dust, but the roof didn't leak, and the stove worked. They sat on the floor with their backs against the wall, sharing a blanket, watching flames. Dance. Margaret leaned into him. "Thank you for taking me with you." Elias's arms settled around her shoulders. "You didn't leave me much choice." She smiled. "Good." Outside, wolves howled in the distance. Somewhere below, the lights of Ashvale blinked faintly through the trees, distant, fading. A life they'd outlived. "Do you miss it?" Margaret asked. "No." "Not even the forge?" He hesitated. "Maybe. But the work was never what mattered." "Then what did?" He turned to look at her fully. "Waking up with you in the next room." She stared at him, heart fluttering against her ribs like a bird testing new wings. "Say that again." "I'm not a man who repeats himself," Elias muttered. But she knew what he meant. Later, after the fire burned low and the wind died, down Margaret lay beside him on a straw-filled mattress, watching his chest rise and fall. The moonlight through the window caught the silver in his hair, the curve of his jaw, the scar above his brow. She reached for his hand beneath the blankets. "I used to think I was cursed," she whispered. "That anyone who tried to love me would suffer for it." "You're not cursed," he said, his voice rough with sleep. "You're just stronger than they could handle." She pressed her forehead to his arm. "Do you really believe that?" He didn't answer, but his hand closed around hers firm and steady, and that was enough. They didn't talk about the future, not that night, not yet. But it lingered between them, like the scent of wood smoke on a wool coat. Something you carried with you, whether you meant to or not. In the morning they would begin again, not because they had no past, but because they had survived it, together. Weeks passed. Spring stretched its arms across the mountains, painting the hillsides with wildflowers and thawing rivers swollen from snowmelt. The trees near the ridge bloomed in soft greens and whites, and the air smelled of pine and fresh soil. Margaret had never known a season could feel like forgiveness. She planted new herbs beside the cabin. Lavender again. Rosemary because it reminded her of home, and a single rose bush, wild and stubborn, at the edge of the fence line. Elias built her a bench beneath it. He didn't say why. He never had to. Their days settled into something steady. Elias hunted in the early mornings, fixed broken planks on the cabin walls, whittled tools and handles in the late afternoons. Margaret cleaned, cooked, read. She wrote letters even if she never sent them. One to her younger sister, one to a mother long past, one to herself. Sometimes she left them beneath the rosebush. Other times she burned them. No one from Ashvale came looking. Perhaps the sheriff had grown tired. Perhaps Alden had moved on. Or perhaps Elias's message had been loud enough to echo. Whatever the reason, they were left alone. And in the quiet, Margaret healed. One evening, as the sun slid behind the trees and cast gold over everything, Elias found her in the garden. She was barefoot in the dirt, hands covered in soil, face smudged and glowing. He watched her from the porch for a moment, then walked over and held out a small, square box. She blinked. "What's this?" "Something I had made," he said, almost gruff. Inside was a simple ring, copper and iron, rough around the edges, with a lavender sprig engraved on the inside. Margaret stared at it, then at him. "I don't need it," she said, voice soft. "I know. I'm already yours." "I know," he repeated. "This is just so you never forget it." She slipped it onto her finger, and it fit perfectly. She didn't cry, but she smiled so hard it ached. That night, they shared dinner by candlelight. Just bread and beans and tea, but it felt like a feast. They spoke little. They never needed many words. Afterward, as she washed the dishes, Elias came up behind her, wrapped his arms around her waist, and rested his chin on her shoulder. "I used to think I'd die alone," he murmured. "So did I," she said. "But here we are." "Yes," Margaret whispered, "here we are." They stood like that for a long time, wrapped in warmth and silence. in a house not filled with riches or visitors or blessings, but filled finally with peace. Ashvale moved on. New scandals came. New faces arrived. Old ones vanished. The town forgot, as towns do. But every so often a child would ask about the scarred woman who once lived in the barn behind the bakery, or the man with the cold eyes who'd silenced a crowd with a single bullet, and someone would whisper, a story about how a feared man had taken in a broken widow and made her his entire world. They never returned to Ashvale, but on the church steps, every spring, a fresh lavender bouquet would appear. No note, no name. Just a silent reminder, she wasn't broken. She was reborn.
We all carry scars, some on our skin, others buried deep where no one can see. But what if love isn't about finding someone who's whole? What if it's about being seen, chosen, and protected, despite the pieces we think make us unworthy? Margaret wasn't broken, she was healing. And Elias, he didn't rescue her because she was weak. He stood by her because he saw her strength beneath the silence. If this story moved you, take a moment to reflect. Have you ever met someone who made you feel seen when the world turned its back? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Share your reflections in the comments below. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and come back for more stories where love rises from the ashes.